Hi, everybody. Hello, hello, welcome. Today we have a discussion panel entitled Preserving Lesbian Histories. I'm super excited to have this conversation with some lesbian archivists in our tri-state area from New York and also from Rhode Island. So yeah, let's get into it. Welcome, Alexis and Mev.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you guys for joining us. I'm super excited to have this conversation with y'all, being archivists and doing wonderful thing with lesbian art. So first, let's start off by introducing yourselves. We can do names, pronouns, and then like about yourselves, the organization you work for slash with, and yeah, whatever else you want the folks to know.
Okay, Alexis, go ahead. You're A. So I'll.
All right. The tyranny of the alphabet, right?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alexis. I use she and her pronouns. I'm currently living in Brooklyn, New York, which is traditionally the home of the Lenape people who've stewarded this land for centuries. And I am really excited to be here. I'm a writer and filmmaker, and I made a film titled All We've Got, which is focused on queer women's spaces and spaces that center queer women in the United States, broadly inclusively. And then I'm also on the coordinating committee for the Lesbian Diversity Archives, which is based here in Brooklyn and was founded in 1974. I've been there for about 10 years, give or take. We'll get into more on that, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay. My name is Mev. I'm currently with the Wanderground Lesbian Archive Library, which is in formation. I'm the lesbrarian and the instigator, and have been putting together a council, and we're getting our nonprofit status together and looking for a space and all of that. But the foundation of the archive starts with the 3,500 plus volumes of books, periodicals, journals, albums, music, lesbian memorabilia, and stuff that I've been collecting over the last 40 plus years. And putting together an archive like this has been something I've been dreaming about for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, perhaps, since I started collecting stuff. So I'm excited to be here. And I'm also real active in OLOC, which is Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, which is a national organization for lesbians 55 years and older, and I started the Rhode Island chapter of OLOC. And other than that, I am retired from paid work and very happy about it.
That's wonderful. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you guys again so much for being here. Erica, unfortunately, was not able to join us for tonight. She had an emergency, but Erica was supposed to be here, but the show goes on. So let's start off by talking about like lesbian history. In your opinion, and this can go to whoever, where do you guys think the lesbian organizing, the height of lesbian organizing was? Like, what was the climate back in those days? Where do you think the politics were?
Well, I would say it depends on which generation you're talking to and about. So one could say it actually started in the 50s and 60s with the old lesbian folks who were in the closet, but who were passing as men, or who were doing what they could do to survive, assuming butch femme roles and those kinds of things. The latter, which was from the Daughters of Bilitis, started back in 1959, I believe, or early 60s. And actually, the June Mazer Archive just sent an email today about the latter and its history and some pictures and that kind of stuff. So that's why that's so fresh in my mind. And then in the 60s, I was a little kid. I didn't know what was going on. But I would say that it really started full blast with the feminists. I think there was a lot of converging things at the same time. The feminist movement definitely moved forward a lot of lesbian activism, I think, during the 70s and the 80s. And so I would say the most active time I would say was like maybe 70s, 80s, 90s in a really out lesbian centered focused cultural way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Alexis, if you want to say anything different.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your point about, and want to just echo your point about thinking about what we mean by lesbian activism at different times, and to understand that it hasn't stopped. Even the homophile organizations like Daughters of Bilitis, which were coming out of the 1950s, had precursors, you know, like in their own way. They may not have been formally organized. Like when I was making my film about queer spaces, one of the things I like to talk about in the Q&As is to remind people that people's homes have been an incredibly important site of organizing and activism for queer folks in general, particularly lesbians and trans people, because it's the space we have. And it was a safer space. You know, when you read, I'm gonna have to like remember, what was I just reading? I'm gonna have to like look up the thing, but I was reading about, I was reading about Mabel Hampton, who was very active in the Lesbian History Archives. And she's a Black woman who was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she was a singer in a nightclub. She worked in her first love came when she worked in the Coney Island, like an all-girls performance troupe in Coney Island, and then she ended up going to the Harlem Renaissance. And if you read her oral histories, we have these amazing oral histories. I mean, we're talking about the 20s, and we're talking about queer women having house parties, creating safe spaces for themselves by sharing like rooming situations together. These are also kinds of organizing that were happening. We may not, you know, it's not a protest on the street, but yeah, I think, yeah, just to echo Matt's point about what activism looks like across time and across different demographic groups, is not always formal organizations that get out in the street. And I think that's so important to remember, because I think when we do narrate history as if it's just that, it tends to focus on like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which are incredibly important times. I'm not in any way diminishing that, but it tends to be a place where we focus a lot of energy when the history is much more complicated and has lasted much longer than that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would even say that even the word lesbian has been very contested over time. You know, that whether, and I would say that there's not a lesbian culture, but lesbian cultures. I mean, kind of like what Alexis was talking about, there was definitely bar cultures. That was a particular, there were the softball and sports and those kinds of cultures that had their own things. There were the music cultures, the festivals and the concerts and the record producers and all that. The women in print movement was another piece of that. I would say that a lot of the organizing, you know, like we say, I think one of the questions you asked in the stuff you sent us, Suyane, was like, what organizations? I was like, a lot of them are local, like not even just in our homes, but like out of women's centers, out of, you know, and I would say that especially in the 70s, a lot of lesbian activism was actually hidden under the banner of feminism. Like you didn't come out as a lesbian. You said you were a feminist supporting women's actions and women's activities, and you might even be supporting gay men or whatever. But there, for a long time, women's music was an euphemism for mostly lesbians doing this music, you know, and so a women's music festival was mostly dykes running around without shirts on. I mean, so, you know, so it kind of, there's all these different ways that we can talk about what made up all the different kinds of lesbian cultures. And so some of it was very political, and some of it was very social, and some of it was somewhere in between. Some of it was very organized, some of it was more casual. You know, so I think, you know, and there were a lot of, lesbians when I was, well, not when I was active because I'm still active, but I would say I've lived in different communities over the years, and each community had its different focus. When I lived in Detroit, it was in the 70s, it was about the bars. When I lived in New Haven, it was in the 80s, it was about street activism, it was the Women's Center, it was the bookstore, it was festivals, it was anti-nuclear rallies, it was anti-oppression work of all kinds, especially against racism. So there's that. And then when I moved to Minneapolis, I was working in a bookstore, and it was about the local community radio station that had a lesbian show and a gay show and all kinds of shows. So I think, and when I moved to Rhode Island, it all kind of shriveled away for me in 2002. I have to say, I don't know exactly what's going on in Rhode Island, but I think all of that arc was sort of like the changing of the times, the changing of emphasis, the changing of what our priorities was, in different periods. It might have been more women's rights and, getting, supporting gay men through AIDS or some of those kinds of things. For a period of time, it was all about marriage rights. And another period of time, it was about gaining custody of your kids and not losing your kids, or even having kids like you wanted to have kids. And what could you adopt your partner's kids, all those kinds of things. So a lot of things around children. So I think there's no one thing, there's all these, like in the 80s, it was all about anti-nuclear activism and the women's peace camps in Seneca, in Germany, and all these places around the country. There were these peace camps, where women were.
What are some? Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
What are some similarities in politics that we could draw from any of those time periods to today's politics? Like, what are lesbians fighting for in today's circles? That wasn't a question I sent you, but that is a question that popped into my mind.
No,
maybe something
okay.
that you guys have seen, maybe something that I have seen.
I mean, I think just to piggyback a little bit on Mev's point, even the term lesbian has been a little bit contested. And so it's hard I really appreciate Mev's point about saying it's plural, lesbian cultures. When I do talks about my film, I always emphasize we have LGBTQ communities. We are not a community singular. We are not a monolith. And when you engage in the history, you find, I wasn't there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because I was still figuring my shit out, and I was not born in the 70s. But it's very clear that there were very different strategies and very different priorities. Like, a lot of people rejected the homophile movement and found that it was too assimilationist and too middle class and too white. So, I would say it would be really hard to, as much as we want to draw like a clear narrative, I think it can be, I think it's to our advantage to engage with the complexity, is what I would say. Because, like, just as a simple example, I think a lot of people have a sense about questions about who was included in these groups, who was included in the Daughters of Bilitis, whether it's race, whether it's trans folks, and that goes throughout. And it's more complicated than these simplistic narratives want us to believe. I find a lot of times there's this sort of revisionist history happening where people are like, oh, well, dykes have never had trans women involved in their spaces, and that's just patently false. Part of what happened that created sort of a public rift in the community is there was a woman by the name of Sharon Stone who was very active in Olivia Records, and she was under public pressure from people like Janice Raymond, forced out of Olivia Records, despite the fact that the staff wanted her to stay. So I think when we just have to be careful about oversimplifying, because there's such richness in engaging with the complexity of the history, I think. I don't know what you think, Mev.
Yeah, I put in the chat. I don't know if this is visible to everybody or if it's a public chat or a private chat, but there's a book by Jean Cordova that's called When We Were Outlaws. So if you weren't around in the 1970s, that book is really rich in terms of what was happening for lesbians in California. I think that was in, I want to say in the Los Angeles area, West Hollywood area, down in that area. She was one of the founders and editors of the Lesbian Tide, but she talks about the difficulties around what was happening with lesbians, with feminism, with gay men, with a lot of police and FBI infiltration of spaces and organizing, that leftist organizing that was going on then. So it's a fascinating book. And because I wasn't really aware in the 70s, it was really eye-opening for me to read all that. I would say, to go back to your question, Suyane, I think the fact that being lesbian is so contested. In the 70s and 80s, there was a strong sense of tension between gay men and lesbians because, by and large, and this is a gross generalization, but I would say by and large, gay men didn't understand about women and feminism, and they didn't get what women's rights were about, and they didn't get, and Jean Cordova talks about this, they didn't really get why it was important for gay men to understand why women's rights were so important, because it impacted them, but that was a piece of him, and so I think when lesbians realized that we can't always coalition well with gay men, we started a lot of our own stuff. And because we couldn't get printed in the mainstream press, printers wouldn't even print our stuff. So we had to start our own our own printing companies, and then our own publishing companies. They wouldn't record our music, so we started our own recording labels. So there was a lot of stuff that happened because we wanted it to happen, and it wasn't going to happen unless we did it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a certain kind of like can-do spirit, I think, that was happening.
That's a DIY
time period. I think that, and in that time period, there was a problem with the word queer, because queer was a negative thing. It was a put down. It was that you didn't use that word. You didn't use the word dyke. You didn't use the word faggot. You didn't use those words because they were, in mainstream culture, things to put us down. Over time, lesbians said, dykes. I'm a dyke. You know what? I'm taking it back. I like this word. I'm using this word. I'm using dyke. There are a lot of lesbians who will not call themselves lesbians. They might say they're gay women. They might say they like to hang out with women. They won't use the word feminist. And that's all okay. But I think that there is a lot of, how can I say this? There still is contention around who is a lesbian and what is a lesbian and what is a lesbian about and what does it mean. And that is complex. It's problematic. Sometimes it's hurtful. And I would say, in the questions that you sent us, you said something about the dying lesbian culture. I don't think it's dying. I think it's disappearing. I think that there are ways in which some of what we have done and accomplished is not known, especially to younger generations of lesbians. I had a 20-something lesbian say to me one day, we don't know our history. We don't know any of this stuff. And I'm pissed off that these lesbian spaces that y'all created in the 80s don't exist anymore, because I would go there. I want to go there, but I can't find it anymore. It doesn't exist. And so I think that, and that's not to say there aren't any spaces. I would say that there are a lot fewer spaces than there had been. And I could be called out on that, and I could be called wrong. But when you listen to folks in my generation, and we're talking 60s, 70s, 80s, the older generation, a lot of things that we put our heart and soul and sweat and life and sacrifice into, many of those things have in fact disappeared for a lot of reasons, for a lot of various reasons. But I give it to the Lesbian History Archives. Y'all are 40 years old and still going strong. And that is amazing to me. Out of the 150 lesbian feminist bookstores that existed in the 1990s, you can count on two hands how many are left. and I think it's changing. There are more bookstores coming up. There's more publishers coming up. There's more zines coming up. It is happening. It's not quite as visible to me and to many others as it might have been at a certain period of time, because there aren't the spaces for us to go to where we can see them and talk about them and have them and be in them and kind of swim in the pond, if you will. That's my perspective, and others may disagree with me, but that's my perspective.
What
do you think?
I'd love to just pick up on that thought, because this comes up a lot when I'm screening a film, or it comes up a lot even at Lesbian History Hours, archive events, this question of lesbian erasure or lesbian disappearance. And I like to resist that narrative myself, for a lot of reasons. One, because, well, on a basic level, so the film that I made specifically looks at spaces that have survived, meaning that lasted from their founding until today. They haven't closed. And the key, aside from owning real estate, which, let's be clear, is number one. Yeah. Capitalism, late stage capitalism, where we're at in capitalism right now that is a number one. And it is not a failure of lesbians. It is not a failure of us that we have not figured out how to compete against that, because it is a societal and structural problem that we and countless other communities and cultures are struggling against. But the second reason that these organizations are surviving is because they are intergenerational. And what that says to me is that, because let's think about something like Daughters of Bilitis, right? It doesn't exist anymore. It petered out pretty quickly once things like the 70s and 80s started to come in and a totally new style of activism started to happen. And a lot of those people flatly rejected the homophile movement, again, because it felt, for a lot of people, very assimilationist, very white, very middle class. But that, I don't think, means that Daughters of Bilitis was a failure, that it's been erased, that it's been disappeared. I think that things changed. And the people who were involved in it were not able, the organization was not limber enough to shift with the times. And so it went its way. And I would like to, going back to what we talked about earlier, I would really love to think about narratives that resist the sense of disappearance and engage with the sense of change. And so here's where I will actually try to answer your earlier question, even though I said I wouldn't, or I resisted answering it, which is to say that I think, one really simple example. Lesbians, especially lesbians in the 70s and 80s who were resisting assimilationist politics, were saying, I am a woman, even if I have sex with other women, even if I have a mustache, even if I wear pants, no matter what I do, if I say that I'm a woman, I'm a woman. Things got more complicated because we know that lesbian definitions are more complicated. So again, I'm simplifying like Mev did. But part of the fight there was to say, you don't define me, I define me. I get to say what I am, regardless of my outward appearance, what I do in my private space. And that, I think, is the most amazing legacy that is absolutely carrying forward. And I think helped, in tandem with the trans rights movement that was happening at the time. These are movements that have helped us expand. If you read a lot of the history about the 70s and 80s, people were struggling with feeling like they had to conform in some of these spaces. They had to cut their hair a certain way, wear a certain uniform to participate in women's music festivals, or some of the lesbian lands. It felt, you read narratives over and over where people felt a little conformist. They felt a little trapped by it. It didn't feel right to me. So the expansion of these definitions is part of the legacy that we get from this amazing activism that happened. So I don't think of it as a contraction. I think of it as an expansion born of that amazing activism. It's the legacy of that we are living in now. I 100% agree that marginalized histories are nearly impossible to access. Like, it's why we have the Lesbian History Archives is filled with people who are undergraduates, who are desperate and excited and thrilled and just really coming into the space to learn and access the history. So yes, there's a huge problem in public narratives around marginalized histories. Lesbians, I think, again, are not unique in that. We have our unique set of problems, patriarchy, misogyny, like there's a lot of things that make it feminist and lesbian history challenging to locate. But I don't think that means that we're disappearing. In fact, I observe an extraordinary resurgence in interest in creating spaces, in creating public representations of these histories. I could go on and on. I'll stop there.
Oh, no, that was wonderful. I just got a question from an audience member that I think, oh yeah.
Can I just make one correction? I put it in the podcast. I said Sharon Stone. Sorry, I should have said Sandy Stone. So it was Sandy Stone involved in Olivia Records. I apologize for my mistake.
No problem. Thank you for the correction. So somebody is asking us a question that has to do with what we're talking about right now. Kay says, hi, I have a question. I was wondering if y'all could speak to the topic of lesbian spaces in the 21st century. There are only something like 22 lesbian bars left in the US. Does this concern you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think the thing about bars, and I'm sorry that Erica isn't here because I would be really curious to see what she says. But
yes,
I would like to give an example of bars from when I lived in Detroit in the late 1970s. And this goes back to different kinds of lesbian experiences and communities. So when I lived in Detroit in the late 1970s, there were 3 bars that I was aware of. There were probably many more, but in the larger Detroit area, there were 3 bars that I was aware of. And I was just newly coming out. So I was like all like strange and afraid and all of that. So the one bar was an abandoned garage in a big parking lot in the middle of nowhere with no lights. You parked in the parking lot and you went to the door. It's like a speakeasy. You knocked on the door. Somebody would open the door and look at you and say, okay, you can come in, and then you could go in. So it was very scary in that sense because it was in a dark place. And it was because nobody wanted to be out. I mean, you didn't want to be outed. And that particular bar had the disco ball, and we all drank beer and we danced. And it was mostly younger folks for the most part, pretty relaxed, that kind of thing. The other bar I went to was one that you could tell had more of a professional upper class sort of feel. They were like drinking mixed drinks and sitting in comfortable chairs, and they had space, and there was maybe a little dancing, but it felt more not a place I wanted to be because I didn't feel like I fit in because I was college age and younger and didn't have any money, and that just didn't feel right to me. The other bar we went to was all the way across the other side of town. Same thing, dark place, parking lot, no lights. You went in, and it was clearly a very much role-centered, butch femme, tough dyke bar. And when I was there, a fist fight broke out on the dance floor. I was like, okay, I'm out of here. That was not my crowd either. So there are a lot of different ways. And when I lived in New Haven, there were a lot of different bars then, mostly gay bars that allowed lesbians in the back, in the basement, or somewhere else, not very public. You had to walk through whatever in order to get to. And that's, so many spaces, there weren't necessarily lesbian bars per se. Yeah. I think that part of the thing with lesbian bars is that alcoholism was a big problem for many dykes, and because we took to the bottle. We couldn't be out. We weren't happy with ourselves. We had low self-esteem. We didn't know where we fit in the world. Everything was uncomfortable. We were fighting with everybody and fighting with ourselves, and so we drank. And so I think there was that was one of the issues with lesbian bars, was the problem of alcoholism. And so I think that's why many lesbians, certainly not all, but many lesbians actually moved away from the bar scene and started looking for other spaces where they could be, where they could socialize and have fun, softball team, bowling leagues, other spaces where they could be and socialize and not get drunk.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of what that was about. That's all of this. I just want to say, it's my perception of the history as I lived it. So if somebody else might come up with a completely different memory or story or whatever. In terms of why there's so few lesbian bars across the country now, I think Alexis hit it. Some of it's real estate, some of it's co-optation, some of it is saying, can we actually have a lesbian only space? And I think that is really contested. Like, what does it mean to have a lesbian space? Because all of these people want to be in the space with us. And what does lesbian space look like? And I'm not really sure any of us really know the answer to that question, really. I mean, we have some idea of what it looked like to some people in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and maybe even now, but I don't know what, I have an idea of what I want it to look like, but I'm not sure that we know what. So it's about lesbian bars, but it's also about lesbian clubs or lesbian centers or lesbian spaces of any kind. If you don't let all these other people in, then it becomes not a lesbian space anymore, potentially. So I think that narrative of not so many lesbian bars fit into the whole thing about, and I would say, I mean, I think Alexis is right that some of it's about real estate, some of it's about co-optation. As soon as Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all those things figured they could make money on lesbian books, they put all the lesbian bookstores out of business, and now they don't sell lesbian books anymore. And we can't sell them either because we don't have that many bookstores left. I mean, there are some bookstores around, and there's still some very successful publishers around. So it's not that it's completely gone. It's just different.
I'd love to respond to one quick point that was made. 100% agree about the fact that, like, bars being a center of addiction in the past is a huge issue. I know there's a huge movement to try to create sober parties and sober events for all people, and queer people are no different from that. They're looking for ways to engage with each other in a sober environment. The thing I want to say is, like, what is a lesbian space? This has been a question for decades. This is not a new question. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say about that is, and I'm a student of history, again, I was coming into queer spaces much more recently than Mev. So again, these are my biases. These are I rely a lot on historical texts, on oral histories, on interviews with people. But what I've learned as a student of history, at least from what I've read, is that lesbian spaces were never exclusively lesbian. There were constantly bisexual folks in those spaces. There were very regularly trans people, transmasculine, transfemme people in these spaces. And the reason, Mev hit on it, the reason is because there was nowhere else to go. Most of the gay men's bars were not tolerant of those communities. And so lesbian spaces, people assimilated if they needed to. I think Mev did a great job of explaining that bars to this day remain stratified across class, across race. They're different regionally. How people behave and represent themselves is different regionally. And so this sort of myth that I think a lot of people of my generation, and I'm generalizing, so I should bring it in a little and be like, I know that in conversations that I have, there's a sense for people who weren't alive in the 60s and 50s in particular, you know, you read an Anne Bannon book, or you read, you know, Audre Lorde Sami, and she has this chapter talking about the bars. It seems very alluring, but like a lot of these bars were run by the mob. The addiction wasn't just social and internal issues. In mob bars, if you read the oral histories, they would come up, and if you weren't drinking, you couldn't be in the bar. You couldn't even take your drink into the bathroom, because if you took your drink into the bathroom, you might fill it with water to try to disguise the fact that you didn't want to drink anymore. So it was actually like an enforced pushing people towards drinking even more, just to be present in the space. So these were not like utopic spaces, you know, and I think there's a myth that queer bars are this utopic space. We'll walk in and we'll meet our lover and we'll meet our friend. And the other thing too is, having talked to a number of activists across generations, not a lot of activism happened in bars. The activism was happening elsewhere. So bars have never really been a site of political activism. Certainly sometimes things happened. People organized when they were trying in New York City, the folks who were trying to resist the mob-owned bars were organizing their own women's dances as a way to like create an alternative to those spaces. Mm-hmm. So I don't mean to dismiss social spaces. They're absolutely central. Like, we're part of what makes us queer is we want to like make out with other queer people or learn from other queer people. You know, it's sexiness shouldn't be forgotten in all of this too, for the folks who are queer because of their sexuality. But yeah, like bars are not idealized spaces. And I really encourage folks, I'm 42, who are my age and younger, to really like put a pin in these ideas a lot of people have about bars being these idealized spaces. They serve a purpose. They're great. I have no qualms with people wanting to create new bars. I think that's great. It's an option. But I think we focus sometimes a little too much on bars to the exclusion of other spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was great. I agree with both of you. I am also a little, I'm sad that Erica couldn't be here with us because she did the Lesbian Bar Project, which is a documentary for folks who don't know. You can watch it somewhere on the internet. But I will speak for people my age as someone who does not drink. So I, don't go to the bars for the alcohol. I go for the social aspect, and as well as someone who's 24 years old. So I am a very young lesbian. I think that bar culture, specifically lesbian bar culture, has the need to expand and make it like a queer culture, like with bars that like serve mocktails, which can be very fun. I preferably like Shirley Temples, but mocktails are very fancy and inclusive. That's what we need, is inclusivity in spaces to like accommodate to everybody, because the bar scene is, social spaces are smaller and smaller, but like Alexis said, activism didn't even happen in the bars. I mean, it could have, but people's houses were a huge gathering space, or like women's center or pride centers. The New Haven Pride Center has a common room for anybody who's trying to organize whatever. Yeah.
Well, and bars were also a place of danger to some of us.
Yeah, police brutality.
When I was living in New Haven, there was one bar that was down by the docks that was, mostly lesbians went there, but every now and then there were these older men who were from the dock area, Fisher people or whoever they were. I don't know who they were. And they kind of come by and kind of ogle, whatever. And one time in particular, I remember that one of them got a little handsy, if you will. And we sort of, became big dykes, basically kicked them out, only to find out an hour later when we all went back out that many of our tires had been slashed. Mm. So, I don't know if it was that guy or if it was somebody else who figured out it was a lesbian bar. And so that's, and I have to say that the other thing too is that this whole thing about spaces and whether or not they're lesbian spaces, I just also want to remind us that women are under attack as women. Women as women, especially women with girlhoods, are under attack, whether it be abortion rights, in violence against women, all of these different ways, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And when I was working at Bloodroot Restaurant in Bridgeport in the 1980s, it was a public restaurant, so it was open to anybody and everybody, but they really wanted to make one night for women only. It wasn't even lesbian only, it was for women only. One night a week for women only. Legally, they weren't really supposed to do that. And every now and then, some male person would really try to assert I can come here. It's a public restaurant. What do you mean that's for women only? So we had to go about a very smart strategy of trying to figure out how we could, for one night a week, for 2 hours, have women only space. There's something very, very powerful about women only space. And many of us have not experienced that. And those of us who have really want it and treasure it, even if it's just 2 hours a week, once a week. But the way we got around it was that we created the Goody Knapp Historical Society. Goody Knapp was a witch who was burned in that area of Black Rock, Connecticut, in the 1800s, something or other. I can't remember. But we started the Goody Knapp Historical Society. And in order to come into the restaurant on Wednesday night, you had to be a member of the Goody Knapp Historical Society. You had little membership cards and everything. And but we had to still be very careful about how we approach that. Who could be a member? Basically anyone who showed up at the door, she was automatically a member of the Goody Knapp Historical Society. She got a card, whatever. But that was the way we had to do that. And so I think that when we're talking about, and you may have noticed, I never use the word queer in talking about myself. I'm a lesbian. Not queer, just a type. I'm a lesbian, and I think it's really important for me over and over again to say, lesbian, I'm a lesbian, I'm here, I'm a lesbian, I'm a lesbian.
Mev, I think we're having audio difficulties. I think I'm also having audio difficulties.
Did you hear what I just said?
Very muffled.
I don't know why. You need me to leave and come back?
Patrick, who's producing, am I also, can you hear me puzzled? Okay. So it's everybody.
It's only because I said the word lesbian a bunch of times.
Yeah. Let's try having you hop off, Mev, and then come back in, because it started when you can just click the same exact link that I sent you.
All right, I gotta find it first.
Okay.
I
think that's.
Yeah, I think
it looks better. Okay.
Yeah, I think she might need to have some headphones. So usually the feedback is from the mic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll continue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did you say everything that you wanted to say, Alexis, about the bar cultures and stuff?
Yeah, I think I just wanna the gist of what I got from Mev was the desire for exclusive spaces and defining that exclusivity around women or around lesbian. And I don't think caucus spaces are a bad thing. I think they can be really useful. What I want to say is I think we need to challenge ourselves to broaden our relationship to the word lesbian. And remember that there are trans dykes, and remember that there are non-binary dykes, and remember that there are people who walk into these spaces who do identify as lesbian or do identify as woman, but they don't necessarily look the way we expect them to or act the way we expect them to. That's so important for all of us to really resist looking for familiarity in these groups and looking for like a comfortable, easy alliance, because exactly to the point that we started off with, that Mev said so beautifully, we are cultures, we are communities, we are not a monolith. Lesbian has never been a monolith. It never was. And those histories, yeah, Mev,
can you turn your mic? Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. Again, just all I can speak to is the people I have conversations with, my own experience is like people felt forced to conform in these spaces. They felt forced to behave in certain ways in these spaces that weren't comfortable for them. And also there was a lot of like racial and class, which I think, again, Mev touched on. There's a lot of racial and class discomfort across these different spaces. We do not all have the same politics. Lesbian, like the thing about LGBTQ identities is they're across every other identity. And so we have more different about us than we have in common, actually. And so when we talk about caucus spaces where we say, this is a space for lesbians, we need to make sure that we're not policing who is included. If somebody shows up and says they're a lesbian, we need to take them at their word.
I agree. I agree that excluding people does more harm than it does good, especially in these days when we have such an expansive what am I saying? Like an expansive amount of genders and sexualities. I think it's very important to be as inclusive as possible, which is why for my programmings, although I'm like technically the women's program coordinator, I like to say women and non-men, which gives people like non-binary dykes a space to congregate. Because if I just say women or lesbians, it can exclude some people, and sometimes we don't mean to do that. But I think as the culture shifts, language has to shift with us, which is why I prefer using the word dyke. We have dyke night every other month here in New Haven, and I always say we don't tolerate biphobia, we don't tolerate transphobia, and this is a space for dykes, like not specifically for lesbians. I think dyke is just a much more broader, expansive word than lesbian, although I also identify personally as a lesbian. But for me, just dyke and queer is an umbrella term, basically. Yeah.
Well, and also just to echo that, one of the folks that I interviewed for the film, Deb Edel, who's the founder of the Lesbian History Archives, talks about this complexity of maintaining a space, maintaining an archive. The space is not exclusive, but maintaining an archive with people who use that label lesbian or embrace it in some way, shape, or form in their life, whatever that means. And one of the points she raises is that not all lesbians identified as women, so we can't take it for granted. There were a lot of butch folks who didn't identify as women, who strongly identified as butch dykes, as butch lesbians, but didn't necessarily. So like, it's so complicated. But I think caucus spaces have a real value. I think we just need to make sure we're not bringing too many assumptions to what we think those words mean, so that the caucus space can really show us what these communities look like.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that's all the questions that I had for you guys. It doesn't look like anybody else. If anybody who's watching us wants to type in the comments wherever they're watching, you can type it in there and we will see it. If you had a question for either Alexis or Mev, now's the time to ask. While we're giving those folks some time to type up their questions, do you guys want to plug in? I know you did plug in the beginning when you talked about yourselves, but plug in anything you guys are working on now, any projects, maybe where people can find you. Now's the time. And I will mute.
I'll just say that the Lesbian History Archives reopened this summer. I'm thrilled to say that we are again able to accommodate the public. You know, COVID is obviously not gone or over and won't be soon, but we came up with some protocols and some ways that we feel comfortable as a collective. And so please check out lesbianhistoryarchives.org. We have a ton of materials that have been digitized, many of which you can at least figure out like how you might be able to access them through our website. So if you live in New Haven and getting on the train is not really practical for you, you can still find a lot of resources that you might be able to access on the website. And then I'll just say for my film, allwe'vegot.org, you can watch the trailer and learn a little bit more there.
And I also want to say for Wanderground, we're still in the process of being founded. Basically, we have no space yet. All the collection is currently in my house, and my goal is to get it out of the house. But I have a starter collection, if you will, of 3,500 plus books, periodicals, records, music, memorabilia, buttons, and all kinds of stuff that I've been gathering for the last 40 years. And right now I do have an exhibit in the Providence Public Library of many of the early items from lesbian cultures from the 70s through up to about 2000, because I tried to really feature some of the older items. And in full disclosure, I am not a historian. I'm just a collector of stuff. And I don't interpret it. I just gather it. So that's pretty much where I am with it. But we are in the process of becoming a nonprofit. Hopefully, the bylaws are written and we're working on incorporation, and then we will hopefully find a space soon. But if you happen to be in Providence, Rhode Island until the end of August, that display is available.
Wonderful. All right, well, it doesn't look like anybody has any other questions. Oh, that's okay. Yeah.
I thought I saw a question pop up at the bottom of the screen. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, it was Karen saying, this has been a really interesting and informative. Thank you so much, Mev, Suyane, and Alexis.
Hi, Karen.
Right.
Thank you. Karen's a friend of mine. So hi, thank you.
Hello, Karen. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Alexis and Mev, for being here. Thank you for your time and for your thoughts and opinions. This was hopefully informative. It was definitely, I learned a lot, and I hope that other people learned a lot too. And yeah, thank you guys so much. And I'll see y'all later.
Thanks for having us.